What if love could defy nature itself? When a desperate call for help leads John and his loyal golden retriever, Bella, to three orphaned lion cubs, an unimaginable bond begins to form. But can a dog truly become a mother to the wild? And what happens when nature tests the limits of that love? Stay with us as we uncover a story of survival, sacrifice, and the extraordinary power of an unbreakable connection. The ringing phone shattered the quiet of John Harrison's cabin, its sharp tone cutting through the steady hum of the rain against the windows. He glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. No good call ever came at this hour. He reached for the phone with a practiced urgency, his pulse quickening. "Harrison," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "John, it's Dr. Patel from Wilson Wildlife Reserve. We need you here. Now." The woman's voice was taut, edged with worry. John sat up instantly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "What's going on?" "Three orphaned lion cubs. Their mother's gone, disappeared without a trace. They're weak, dehydrated, and we don't have a surrogate. They won't last long without help." John was already moving, pulling on a worn flannel shirt over his t-shirt, his mind racing through possible solutions. "How long have they been alone?" 2 days, maybe 3. We found them huddled together near the riverbank, barely moving. We're stabilizing them, but—" She hesitated. "They're too young, John. They need a mother." John's heart clenched at the thought of the tiny cubs struggling to survive without their mother's warmth. He had seen it too many times. Abandoned, orphaned, defenseless creatures fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight. "I'm on my way," he said, grabbing his keys from the counter. As he turned toward the door, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. Bella, his golden retriever, had lifted her head from her bed near the fireplace, her amber eyes watching him intently. She was old enough to know when something was wrong. John crouched beside her, running a hand over her soft fur. "We've got work to do, girl," he murmured. Bella's tail gave a slow wag, and as he stood, she was already on her feet, ready to follow him. The drive to Wilson Wildlife Reserve was long and lonely, the rain slicking the road into a mirror of ghostly reflections. John's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind darting between worst-case scenarios. He had spent most of his life working with animals, rescuing the ones the world had abandoned. Some days the victories were enough to keep him going. Other days the losses threatened to unravel him. Bella sat in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, ears twitching at the sound of the rain. She had been by his side through it all, trailing after him on rescues, watching over injured animals with the kind of patience only a mother could muster. As they pulled up to the reserve, the floodlights cast long shadows across the damp ground. The main building stood in the center, a sturdy structure surrounded by acres of protected land. John parked the truck and jumped out, Bella right behind him. Dr. Patel met him at the entrance, her dark eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "They're in the clinic," she said without preamble, leading him inside. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and damp fur. The low whimpers of the cubs drifted through the space, fragile and barely there. John stepped forward, his breath catching at the sight of them. 3 tiny bodies curled together beneath a heat lamp, their fur damp and matted. One lifted its head weakly, blinking up at him with unfocused eyes before collapsing against its siblings. "They've been given fluids, but they won't eat," Dr. Patel said softly. "They're shutting down." John reached out, his fingers brushing against the smallest cub's fur. The warmth of its tiny body was barely there, its breathing shallow. He swallowed hard. "No surrogate mothers in the reserve?" She shook her head. "We tried introducing them to a lioness who recently lost her cubs, but she rejected them. They're too weak. They need constant warmth, care." Her voice faltered. "They need a mother." John felt Bella brush against his leg, and as he looked down, he saw her ears perked, her eyes locked onto the cubs. Slowly she stepped forward, her nose twitching as she took in their scent. Dr. Patel stiffened. "John, she's a dog." "I know," he murmured, watching Bella carefully. The golden retriever took another step closer, then lay down just beside the cubs, her body still but attentive. She let out a soft whine, lowering her head toward them. The smallest cub stirred, turning slightly toward her warmth. John held his breath. One by one, the cubs shifted, instinct pulling them toward the warmth radiating from Bella's body. The smallest nestled against her fur, its tiny paws twitching. Dr. Patel exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "John, I think we found our surrogate," he said quietly. They stood in silence as Bella remained completely still, her body a steady source of warmth for the cubs. It was as if she understood exactly what they needed. John crouched beside her, stroking her gently. "Good girl," he whispered. As the rain continued to beat against the roof, the room was filled with a fragile kind of hope. The cubs had a chance now, and for John, who had spent so much of his life trying to mend what was broken, this moment, watching Bella take these orphaned creatures as her own, was a reminder that sometimes love and survival weren't about blood. They were about something deeper, something stronger. And for the first time that night, John allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would make it. The first rays of dawn crept through the clinic windows, casting a soft golden hue over the quiet room. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush that settled over the reserve like a fragile promise of renewal. John sat against the wall, his arms resting on his knees, watching Bella as she lay curled around the cubs. The sight was nothing short of miraculous. The three tiny bodies, once trembling and frail, now nestled securely against her warmth. Their breathing was slow but steady, their fragile ribs rising and falling in a rhythm that spoke of quiet survival. Bella's own chest moved in a calming cadence, her body relaxed but watchful, her golden fur rising and falling like the steady tide. It was instinct, pure and unshakable. John rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at Dr. Patel, who sat beside him with a clipboard resting on her lap, though she hadn't written a word in over an hour. She had spent the night monitoring the cubs, but more than that, she had been watching Bella, as if still trying to understand the impossible bond unfolding before them. "I don't get it," she murmured, shaking her head slightly. "She isn't just letting them use her for warmth. She's licking them, nudging them closer. It's as if she knows exactly what they need." John exhaled a quiet breath, stretching his stiff shoulders. "She does know," he said, his voice low but certain. "She's been around rescues her whole life. She's seen me work, seen animals come in broken and desperate, and she's always known what to do." He smiled faintly, watching as Bella carefully licked one of the cub's ears, her nose nudging it closer as the tiny creature let out a contented sigh. "But this is different. This isn't just her being gentle. This is maternal." Dr. Patel frowned slightly but didn't argue. Instead, she leaned forward, studying the cubs more closely. "The smallest one was barely responding last night," she murmured. "Now look at him." She pointed at the tiniest of the three, a cub whose body had seemed limp and lifeless just hours before. Now he was tucked securely against Bella's chest, his little paws curled into her fur, his breathing slow but strong. John didn't respond. He didn't need to. The evidence was right in front of them. Bella had given them something no human could. Comfort beyond medicine, warmth beyond science, a reason to hold on. The quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of the clinic door opening. One of the reserve caretakers, David, stepped inside, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a cautious look in his eyes. "Morning," he greeted, nodding toward the cubs. "How are they?" Dr. Patel stood, stretching her arms before glancing down at her notes. "Better than expected. They're responding to Bella more than they did to any of us." David's brows lifted as he took a sip of coffee. "You're telling me a golden retriever is playing foster mom to lion cubs?" John smirked, standing and rolling the stiffness from his shoulders. "I'm telling you Bella might be the best shot they have." David let out a low whistle and crouched beside the sleeping cubs, shaking his head in disbelief. "That dog never stops surprising people, does she?" "No," John said, his gaze softening as he watched Bella give another slow, deliberate lick to one of the cubs' fur. "She never does." The next few days passed in a blur of careful feeding, constant monitoring, and an increasing realization that Bella was more than just a comforting presence. She was actively saving the cubs. She kept them warm during the coldest hours of the night, encouraged them to eat when they were reluctant, and even let out low, motherly whines when they strayed too far from her side. It was something John had never seen before, something that defied every expectation of nature. But not everyone at the reserve was convinced this was a good thing. "I don't like it," one of the senior caretakers, Philip, said one afternoon as he stood near the clinic doorway, arms crossed tightly. "They're lions, John. They need to be raised with their own kind, not coddled by a domestic dog." John sighed, already prepared for this argument. "They don't have their own kind," he said evenly. "We tried introducing them to another lioness. She rejected them. If we don't do something, they won't survive." Philip shook his head. "And what happens later? When they grow too big, too wild, when their instincts kick in and they don't see Bella as their mother anymore?" John hesitated. It was a valid concern. These cubs were not meant to stay tame, no matter how much Bella nurtured them now. At some point, they would have to find their place in the wild. And when that day came, Bella would no longer be able to protect them. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there," he said finally. Philip didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving John alone with his thoughts. That night, as John lay in the small cot in the clinic, he watched Bella as she curled around the cubs, her presence a shield against the unknown. He wanted to believe this would work, that they were doing the right thing. But in the back of his mind, Philip's words lingered. What happened when love wasn't enough? Morning arrived with a cool breeze sweeping through the reserve, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh grass. John stepped outside, rubbing his temples. Sleep had been scarce, his mind restless with possibilities. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice Bella padding beside him, her tail swaying lazily as she walked. But she wasn't alone. The smallest cub, the one they had worried about the most, was stumbling after her, his tiny legs unsteady but determined. John blinked in surprise, then watched as Bella paused, looking back at the cub before lowering her head to nuzzle him forward. The little one let out a soft squeak but obeyed, following her toward the open space of the yard. John exhaled a quiet laugh. "You're teaching them to follow you now?" Bella wagged her tail, her eyes bright, and John knew without a doubt that she understood exactly what she was doing. Over the next few days, Bella continued guiding the cubs, not just offering warmth, but gently coaxing them into movement, into curiosity. She would nudge them when they hesitated, lead them toward food when they were reluctant to eat, and even correct them with a soft but firm growl when they tried to bite too hard during play. It was nothing short of remarkable. Still, John knew they were working against time. The cubs were growing stronger, but with strength came instinct. The line between survival and domestication was fragile, and soon decisions would have to be made about their future. On the fifth morning, as John stepped outside with a cup of coffee in hand, he found Bella sitting near the fence, staring out at the open land beyond the reserve. The cubs were beside her, watching the swaying grass with wide, curious eyes. It was a beautiful, bittersweet sight. John crouched beside Bella, running a hand over her fur. "They're going to leave one day, you know," he murmured. Bella didn't move, but John swore he saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She already knew, and somehow that made it all the more heartbreaking. The days at Wilson Wildlife Reserve blended into one another, each moment a delicate balance between survival and the inevitable truth that loomed in the distance. The lion cubs were growing, their once frail bodies filling out with the strength that only time, nourishment, and love could provide. They still sought Bella's warmth at night, curling against her golden fur like they had since the moment they arrived. But now their movements were more confident, their steps steadier. They were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. John stood by the wooden enclosure, arms crossed as he observed Bella and the cubs playing in the early morning light. The smallest one, whom he had taken to calling Keto, stumbled slightly as he tried to pounce on Bella's tail, his oversized paws tripping over each other. Bella let out a soft huff of amusement and gently batted him away with her nose, her tail wagging as she encouraged him to try again. The other two, Mara and Zuberi, had taken to wrestling with each other, their little growls growing more distinct, more like lions and less like helpless newborns. "They're adapting well," Dr. Patel murmured beside him, her arms tucked into the pockets of her jacket. "Stronger every day." John nodded but didn't take his eyes off them. They are, but they're also getting bigger, more independent. We both know what that means. She sighed, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. We need to start transitioning them away from Bella. They have to learn to be lions, John. He clenched his jaw, not because he disagreed, but because it was the one thing he had been dreading. Bella had done what no one else could. She had saved them, nurtured them, and given them the will to fight. But that fight was taking them toward a future that didn't include her. Inside the enclosure, Bella let out a gentle bark, and the cubs immediately turned their attention to her, eyes bright with curiosity. She took a few steps forward, then looked back, waiting. It was a game they had played many times now. She would lead, and they would follow. Hesitant at first, then with growing confidence, they trailed behind her, mimicking her movements. But this time, when Bella stopped and sat down, Keto surprised everyone. Instead of sitting with her, he took a few more steps forward, his little nose twitching as he inhaled the scent of the wild air beyond the enclosure. He turned back to his siblings, let out a tiny, uncertain growl, then took another step toward the unknown. John's heart tightened. It was happening. The shift. That's the first time one of them has taken the lead without her, Dr. Patel murmured, her voice softer now. John swallowed, watching as Bella remained still, her expression unreadable. But he saw it in the way her ears twitched, in the slight tilt of her head. She recognized it too, the beginning of the end. The next few weeks were spent preparing for what everyone knew was coming. The reserve staff increased their efforts to get the cubs acclimated to the larger enclosures, introducing them to scents and sounds that would prepare them for life beyond human care. They brought in an older lioness, Maya, from another section of the reserve, one who had raised cubs before, and who might, if all went well, accept the three orphans into her pride. Bella watched all of it in quiet understanding. She still cared for the cubs, still let them sleep curled up against her at night, still nudged them toward food when they needed encouragement. But there was a shift in her behavior. She no longer intervened when they played rougher with each other, no longer stepped between them when they tested their little roars. She was letting them be what they were meant to be. John hated every second of it. One evening, after most of the staff had left for the night, John found himself sitting beside Bella in the dim glow of the reserve lights. The cubs were curled up together a few feet away, sound asleep, their bodies twitching as they dreamed. He ran a hand over Bella's fur, feeling the warmth beneath his fingers, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. "You've done something incredible," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Bella lifted her head, her amber eyes meeting his, and for a moment he swore she understood every word. "But you know we have to let them go, don't you?" He exhaled, rubbing his face. "You knew before I did." She let out a quiet sigh and rested her head against his knee. It wasn't resignation, it wasn't defeat, it was acceptance. 2 weeks later, the time had come. The morning air was cool, crisp with the promise of change. The cubs had been moved into the large transition enclosure, where Maya now waited. The moment she had arrived, the staff had watched with held breath as she assessed them with quiet authority, her golden eyes scanning their small bodies before giving a low, approving chuff. It wasn't an instant acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. That was enough. Bella stood beside John just outside the enclosure, watching as the cubs explored their new space. Keto hesitated at first, his little paws digging into the dirt, his eyes flicking back toward Bella, unsure. But then Mara took the lead, brushing against Maya's side, and after a moment, Keto followed. Bella didn't move. John knelt beside her, resting a hand against her fur. "You did it, girl," he whispered. "They're going to be okay." Bella let out a quiet whine, but there was no distress in it, just something soft, something final. The cubs played a few feet away now, tumbling over one another, their tiny roars growing stronger. Maya watched them with the kind of patience only a mother could have. John watched as Bella stepped forward once, twice, then stopped. Keto noticed her, his little ears perking up, his tail twitching. He took a step toward her, then another. John held his breath. Bella stood still. And then, as if something invisible had shifted between them, Keto stopped. He looked at her, his tiny body tense with a kind of longing neither of them knew how to name. Then slowly he turned back toward his siblings. Bella exhaled, her body relaxing. She had done what she came to do. John wiped a hand over his face, swallowing against the ache in his throat. He had always known this would end this way, but knowing didn't make it easier. He reached for Bella's collar, giving it a gentle tug. "Come on, girl," he murmured. "Let's go home." She hesitated for only a second before turning, stepping away from the enclosure, away from her cubs. The drive home was silent. Bella sat beside him in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, watching as the reserve faded into the distance. The weight of her loss, of what she had given, pressed into the air between them, thick and undeniable. But then as John reached over and ran a hand through her fur, Bella let out a slow breath. And in that moment, he knew. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of another. The quiet of the cabin felt heavier than usual, as if the absence of the cubs had left an invisible weight pressing against the walls. John sat on the porch steps, his gaze drifting across the open fields that stretched toward the horizon, where the early morning mist clung stubbornly to the earth. The world was waking up, but inside him, something still felt suspended in that moment of goodbye. Bella lay beside him, her head resting on her paws, her amber eyes distant. She had been like this since they returned from the reserve, calm but quiet, her usual tail wags absent, her presence softer, almost withdrawn. It was as if she understood the finality of it, the way things had to be. John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before reaching over to scratch behind Bella's ears. "You miss them, don't you, girl?" he murmured. Bella's ears twitched, but she didn't lift her head. He couldn't blame her. The cubs had been her world for weeks, their tiny bodies pressed against her, their survival dependent on her warmth, her care. And then, just like that, they were gone. John had seen this kind of grief before, not in animals, but in people. He had felt it himself more times than he cared to admit. Loss had a way of settling into the bones, quiet and heavy, a presence that wasn't quite tangible, but was always felt. It didn't matter that Bella had known, that she had prepared herself in ways even he hadn't. Letting go was still letting go. He stood, stretching his arms before heading back inside, leaving the door open for Bella to follow if she wanted. The cabin smelled of fresh coffee and the lingering scent of pine from the firewood stacked near the hearth. John poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, staring at nothing in particular. He had spent so much time focusing on the cubs, on their survival, on their future, that now with them gone, he wasn't sure what to do with himself. The work at the reserve would continue, of course. There were always more animals to care for, more rescues, more battles to fight. But this had been different. Bella had made it different. A soft thump behind him told him she had come inside. He glanced over his shoulder to see her settling onto her bed near the fireplace, her body curling in on itself. The sight made something tighten in his chest. He had thought, maybe, that she would bounce back quickly. Bella had always been resilient, always adapted. But this was something deeper. A knock at the door startled them both. Bella's ears perked slightly, though she didn't rise. John set his coffee down and crossed the room, pulling open the door to find Dr. Patel standing there, arms crossed against the crisp morning air. "You're up early," John said, stepping aside to let her in. She gave a tired smile. "Could say the same for you." He gestured toward the coffee pot. "Want some?" "God, yes." She poured herself a cup while John waited, sensing there was more to her visit than just an early morning caffeine run. Sure enough, as soon as she took her first sip, she leaned against the counter and sighed. "I wanted to check on Bella." John nodded, glancing toward the retriever, who hadn't moved from her spot. "She's quiet," he admitted. "I figured." Dr. Patel set her cup down, her brow furrowing slightly. "She bonded with them in a way we didn't expect. That kind of bond doesn't just disappear overnight." John exhaled slowly. It doesn't." They stood in silence for a moment before Dr. Patel straightened. "There's something else." John raised a brow. "That sounds ominous." She hesitated, then pulled her phone from her pocket, scrolling before turning the screen toward him. There's a wildlife rescue in India that reached out to us. They heard about Bella and the cubs. They have a situation, another set of orphan cubs. But this time, tigers. John stared at the screen, his mind already racing ahead. They don't know if Bella would take to them the way she did with the lions, Dr. Patel continued. But they're desperate. And after what she did here, she trailed off, giving him a meaningful look. John rubbed his jaw, the familiar tug of responsibility settling over him. It's a risk, he said finally. It is, she agreed, but it's also a chance. For the cubs, and maybe for Bella too. His gaze drifted toward the retriever, still curled up by the fire, her breathing slow and steady. She had given so much of herself to the lions, had poured every ounce of her heart into their survival. And now here she was, lost in the absence of them. Maybe she needed this. Maybe they both did. John ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply before looking back at Dr. Patel. When do we leave? A week later, John found himself stepping off a small plane into the humid, dense air of central India. The difference in climate was immediate, the moisture clinging to his skin as he adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder. Bella trotted beside him, her ears flicking at the unfamiliar sounds, her nose twitching as she took in the new scents. She had been different ever since they left the reserve, more alert, more engaged. It was as if she had sensed, even before John had, that this was a new beginning. They were met by a local conservationist named Rohan, a man with sharp eyes and a quiet intensity that reminded John of himself. He wasted no time in briefing them as they climbed into an old jeep, bouncing over uneven dirt roads toward the rescue site. The cubs were found near a poaching site, Rohan explained, his hands steady on the wheel. Their mother was killed for her pelt. By the time we got there, they were barely alive. They've been stabilized, but they refuse to eat, and without a mother, they're struggling. John nodded, his eyes shifting to Bella, who sat beside him in the back, staring out at the dense jungle. How many? 2. That was better than 3, at least in terms of care. But it was still a monumental task. The lions had been one thing, but tigers were another entirely. They were solitary by nature, more territorial, harder to reintroduce to the wild once they became attached to humans. If this worked, it would have to be done carefully, deliberately. The camp was small but functional, nestled deep in the heart of the reserve where the cubs had been brought for care. John barely had time to set his bag down before they were led to a shaded enclosure, where the 2 cubs lay curled together in a bed of straw. They were smaller than the lion cubs had been, their orange fur marked with soft black stripes that would one day become bold and striking. But now they were just tiny, helpless things, their bodies tense even in sleep. Bella took a step forward, her movements slow, deliberate. She let out a soft huff, lowering her nose toward the cubs. One of them stirred, blinking open, drowsy, unfocused eyes. John held his breath. Bella lay down, stretching out beside them, her body still but inviting. The cubs hesitated, their tiny noses twitching, their ears flicking at the unfamiliar scent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, as if drawn by something beyond instinct, the smaller of the 2 cubs took an unsteady step forward, then another. It pressed its tiny body against Bella's warmth, sighing as it nestled close. John let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was happening again. A new beginning. And this time, he wasn't afraid to let it. The jungle hummed with life, a constant symphony of rustling leaves, distant calls, and the low hum of insects that filled the thick, humid air. The transition from the dry, open landscapes of the African reserve to the dense forests of India had been stark, but Bella had adjusted faster than John had expected. She moved with careful curiosity, her golden coat a stark contrast to the deep greens and browns of the jungle. But there was something familiar in her posture, a quiet understanding of what she was here to do. John stood just outside the shaded enclosure, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the 2 tiger cubs nestled against Bella's side. The smaller of the 2, whom the caretakers had named Ravi, had taken to her almost immediately, pressing himself into her warmth just as the lion cubs had before him. The other cub, Suri, was more hesitant. She was watching, always watching, her golden green eyes filled with a wariness that reminded John of wild animals that had learned too early that the world was not always kind. Rohan stood beside him, his own eyes fixed on the scene before them. "I didn't think it would work," he admitted after a moment. "A dog raising lions was already unbelievable. But tigers?" He shook his head in quiet disbelief. John exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I wasn't sure either." He looked down at Bella, who was calmly licking Ravi's tiny ears, her patience endless. But she was. The first night had been tense. The cubs had been hesitant, their bodies stiff with uncertainty, their instincts warning them that this warm, unfamiliar creature was not their mother. But Bella had waited, her body still and inviting, her steady presence offering them something they hadn't had since their mother was killed. Safety. Ravi had caved first, burrowing against her fur, his tiny body pressing close to absorb the warmth she offered without hesitation. Suri had taken longer. She had watched from a short distance, her ears flicking at every sound, her body tense like she was ready to bolt. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the jungle had settled and the air had cooled, she had moved closer. Now as the morning sun broke through the canopy, streaking golden light across the enclosure, John watched as Suri slowly, cautiously, laid her head against Bella's side. Bella didn't move, didn't startle or react. She simply accepted the small, hesitant weight, allowing the cub to decide the pace of her own trust. Rohan let out a quiet chuckle. "She's something else," he murmured. John smiled, though it was tinged with something heavier, something quieter. "Yeah," he said softly, "she is." The next few days settled into an almost rhythmic routine. The cubs were fed carefully, small amounts at first, their stomachs too weak to handle full meals. John and the caretakers monitored them closely, ensuring they were gaining strength, their bodies filling out from the skeletal forms they had arrived in. Bella remained their constant, always nearby, her body a source of warmth and reassurance. She let them clamber over her, bite at her ears with tiny needle-sharp teeth, practice their pounces against her patient form, and slowly the change happened. The cubs began to play. It was small at first, Ravi batting at Bella's tail, Suri tentatively swiping at a falling leaf. But soon they were tumbling together, rolling in the dirt, their small growls growing more confident. Bella was always at the center of it, guiding them, teaching them boundaries the way a mother would. She would let them push, let them play rough, but the moment they got too aggressive, she would let out a quiet, firm growl, and they would back off, chastised but learning. John watched it all with a quiet awe, knowing what he was witnessing was something rare, something that should have been impossible. Bella wasn't just nurturing them, she was raising them. One evening, as the sky turned a deep indigo and the jungle buzzed with the sounds of nighttime life, John sat outside the enclosure, his back against the rough wooden post of the fence. Bella lay beside him, her fur warm against his arm, her eyes half-lidded in the quiet peace of the moment. The cubs were curled up a few feet away, their tiny bodies rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep. "You've done it again, girl," John murmured, running a hand through her fur. "I don't know how, but you have." Bella let out a soft huff, her body relaxing fully against him. John let his head rest back against the post, staring up at the canopy above. He had thought after the lions that this part of their story was over, that Bella's purpose, the impossible role she had filled, had ended. But now he realized that wasn't true. This was who she was. She wasn't just a dog. She was a mother, and she wasn't done yet. But just as John allowed himself to settle into the comfort of their new reality, fate reminded him that peace was never meant to last. It started with a low, warning growl from Bella. John snapped upright, his senses immediately alert. Bella had risen to her feet, her body tense, ears perked, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the enclosure. The cubs stirred at her sudden movement, their tiny bodies shifting, but they did not wake. John followed her gaze, his pulse quickening. The jungle had gone silent. That was never a good sign. He pushed himself up, careful not to make any sudden movements, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight strapped to his belt. Slowly he flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the dense foliage just beyond the enclosure. Nothing. But Bella's growl deepened, her body moving into a protective stance in front of the cubs. John's stomach tightened. Then a flash of movement. A pair of golden eyes reflected back at him from the undergrowth. John stiffened. A tiger, and not a cub. John's mind raced. It wasn't Maya, the older lioness from the African reserve. This wasn't an animal they had prepared for. This was wild, untamed, and it was watching. John took a slow step forward, his voice low and steady. "Easy," he murmured, though whether it was for Bella or himself, he wasn't sure. The tiger didn't move. Bella remained firm, her body a solid wall between the intruder and the sleeping cubs behind her. John had seen wild animals before, had encountered them in unpredictable situations. But this was different. This tiger wasn't passing through. It wasn't startled. It was watching, and it wasn't leaving. A moment stretched, thick with tension, then movement. Not toward them, but around. John realized with a sinking weight in his chest that it wasn't alone. Another pair of eyes appeared, then another. 3. His stomach twisted. They were surrounded. Bella let out a sharp warning bark, stepping forward, her stance unyielding. John's mind snapped into action. Slowly, without turning his back to the tigers, he reached for the radio clipped to his belt, his fingers moving carefully, deliberately. "Rohan," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "We've got company." A beat of silence. Then, "How bad?" John exhaled. 3 wild tiger, he said, watching as the largest one took a slow step forward. "And they're not just passing through?" The radio crackled. "Hold tight. We're on our way." John didn't move. Bella didn't move. And neither did the tigers. Not yet. But John knew, as sure as the blood pounding in his ears, that something was coming. And whatever it wasn't going to be good. The night air was thick, pressing against John's skin like an unspoken warning. The jungle, which had been alive with its usual hum of life just moments ago, had gone eerily silent, replaced by the quiet, predatory presence of the 3 tigers that surrounded them. Bella stood firm in front of the cubs, her golden fur illuminated by the weak beam of John's flashlight. Her stance unwavering despite the enormous danger before her. Her growls were low, steady, a mother's warning. But John knew that against wild tigers, sheer willpower wasn't enough. The largest of the 3 took another step forward, its muscles rippling beneath its striped coat. Its golden eyes locked onto Bella. It wasn't fear or hesitation that held the predator back. It was curiosity. The smell of the cubs was thick in the air, and this tiger, this unknown force of nature, was deciding whether they were prey or something else entirely. John's heart pounded against his ribs, his grip tightening around the radio. "Rohan, where the hell are you?" he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. 2 minutes out," came the static-filled response. John exhaled sharply. 2 minutes. It might as well have been a lifetime. The second tiger, smaller but no less dangerous, slunk to the side, circling, testing. John knew that if they attacked, there would be no stopping them. Bella could fight, could protect, but she was no match for a wild tiger. She was only one dog, a remarkable one, but a dog nonetheless. Then before John could react, the third tiger, a lean younger male, moved first. A low growl rumbled from its chest as it lunged forward, not at John, not at the cubs, but at Bella. Bella didn't flinch. Instead, she met the tiger head-on. She didn't bark, didn't retreat. She simply planted her feet and let out a sharp, commanding snarl, her teeth flashing in the dim light. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't submission. It was something else entirely. The young tiger skidded to a halt, its ears twitching, confusion flashing in its wild eyes. John felt his breath catch. Bella wasn't fighting. She was communicating. The tiger's nostrils flared as it took in her scent, as if trying to understand what she was. She didn't smell like an enemy. She didn't smell like prey. And most importantly, she didn't smell afraid. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then, incredibly, impossibly, the young tiger let out a low chuff, a sound of acknowledgement, of curiosity, of something that wasn't quite aggression. John barely had time to process what had just happened before headlights cut through the darkness. A jeep rumbled through the undergrowth, its tires skidding to a stop just beyond the enclosure. Rohan and two other rangers jumped out, rifles at the ready, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. "Hold fire!" John shouted immediately, throwing up a hand before any trigger could be pulled. Rohan skidded to a halt beside him, his breath coming fast. "What the hell is happening?" John shook his head, still unable to fully grasp it himself. "Bella. She's stopping them." Rohan's gaze darted to the scene before them. The largest tiger, the leader John assumed, was watching Bella with sharp intelligence, its tail flicking in thought. The younger male had backed off completely, standing a few feet away, still staring at Bella like she was something it had never encountered before. The moment stretched, tense but unmoving. Then, as if some unspoken decision had been reached, the leader tiger turned, exhaling through its nose, and took a step back into the jungle. A slow, deliberate retreat. The other two followed. Within seconds, the undergrowth swallowed them whole. John didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until it left him in a sharp exhale. His knees felt weak. Bella let out a soft sigh, lowering her head, her body relaxing only slightly. She had done what no human, no fence, no weapon could have done. She had stopped them. Rohan ran a hand over his face. "I don't understand. Why didn't they attack?" John shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe Bella reminded them of something. Maybe they recognized something in her. Motherhood, protection, a presence they couldn't define but understood." He swallowed hard. "Or maybe they just didn't see her as a threat." Rohan let out a slow breath, his eyes still locked on Bella. "Whatever it was, she just saved us." John knelt beside her, running his hands through her fur, his fingers shaking slightly. "You never stop surprising me, girl," he whispered. Bella nudged his hand, then turned, making her way back to the cubs. They were still huddled together, their tiny bodies pressed against the dirt, eyes wide and frightened. Bella curled around them, licking their fur, reassuring them that all was well. And somehow, it was. In the days that followed, the story spread. The rangers, the caretakers, everyone who had witnessed it, spoke of the golden retriever who had faced down wild tigers and won without ever lifting a paw in anger. Some called it a miracle. Others called it instinct. But John knew the truth. It was Bella. Just Bella. The tiger cubs grew stronger. They played, they learned, they thrived under Bella's guidance. But John knew their time together was finite. Tigers were solitary creatures. Unlike the lions, these cubs wouldn't grow up in a pride. They would one day need to be alone, to carve out their own space in the wild. And Bella, as she had before, seemed to understand. The day came sooner than John had expected. The reserve had arranged for a protected section of the jungle where Ravi and Suri could be safely introduced into the wild under strict monitoring. The moment of release was quiet, almost surreal. John stood beside Bella as the caretakers opened the enclosure. The cubs hesitated, looking back at their golden-furred mother. Bella stepped forward, nuzzling each of them gently. First Ravi, then Suri. A final touch, a silent goodbye. Then, without hesitation, the cubs turned and stepped into the jungle. John watched them go, his throat tight. Bella sat beside him, her ears twitching as she listened to the sound of their small paws disappearing into the undergrowth. She didn't move. She didn't chase them. She just watched. And when they were gone, truly gone, she exhaled a slow breath and turned to John, her amber eyes meeting his. It was over, and she was ready. The flight back home was long, but Bella rested the entire way, her head on John's lap, her body loose, peaceful. When they arrived at the cabin, she patted inside as if she had never left, curling up by the fireplace with a contented sigh. John sat beside her, his hand resting on her back, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. He had always wondered if he would ever truly understand Bella, if he would ever be able to define the depth of what she had done, what she had given. But now he realized he didn't need to. Bella wasn't a miracle. She wasn't a mystery. She was simply love. Love that knew no species, no boundaries, no limits. Love that could calm lions and soothe tigers. Love that, even in the face of the wild, had never wavered. And as John sat there, feeling the warmth of her beside him, He knew, no matter where life took them next, her story wasn't over. Because love like that never truly ended. It only ever began again. This story is a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that transcend species. Bella's journey shows us that family is not defined by blood, but by the connections we choose to nurture. She gave her heart to creatures that were never meant to be hers, yet she protected, comforted, and guided them as if they were her own. Through her actions, we see that kindness has no boundaries, and even in the face of the wild, compassion can change the course of fate. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery come not from dominance or force, but from patience, understanding, and unconditional love. Whether it was the orphaned lions, the fragile tiger cubs, or the moment she stood her ground against nature's fiercest predators, Bella never wavered in her role as a protector. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible stories of love, survival, and the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.